I didn't just trip over the body. I drove over it. It was 1:17 a.m., exactly 7 minutes after I'd pulled the U-Haul up to the curb of our new house. The sound wasn't a thump. Not really. It was a wet, sickening clunk scrape that shuddered through the rental truck's cabin, followed by the sickening slide of something heavy and soft beneath the oversized tires. I slammed the brakes, the front axle jerking violently. Dust motes danced in the high beams, and the deep, silent rural darkness swallowed the sound of the engine dying. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. Deer. Skunk. I tried to tell myself. But the feeling, that deep, primal terror, screamed something else. Something human. The house loomed in front of me. A beautiful, isolated Victorian with a wraparound porch and too many shadows. We'd bought it cheap, a real fixer-upper, miles from the nearest neighbor. A fresh start. This was supposed to be the first minute of our new life. Instead, it was this. I fumbled for my phone, my hands slick with sweat, but the thought of calling 911 immediately froze me. What would I even say? Hi, I just moved to this very isolated area, and the first thing I did was run over an obstacle that felt suspiciously like a person on my new driveway. That's the kind of call that makes you a prime suspect before the sun even rises, especially when you're driving a massive rented truck full of everything you own. A truck that could just as easily carry anything. I took a shaky breath and pushed the truck door open. The air was cold, damp, and smelled overwhelmingly of pine and freshly turned earth, and now, faintly, something coppery. I walked stiffly to the front bumper. The moon was a sliver of silver hidden behind thin clouds, but the high beams gave me enough light. It wasn't a deer. It was a man. He was sprawled face down in the gravel path, his limbs bent at impossible angles. His shirt, a pale blue cotton, was stained a deep, horrifying crimson that seeped into the crushed stone beneath him. His wallet, or maybe a phone, had flown out of his pocket and lay uselessly a foot away, reflecting the truck lights like a broken piece of glass. My stomach tried to climb into my throat. I stumbled backward, landing on the U-Haul's running board, sucking in desperate gasps of air. My mind was screaming, but no sound came out. He was dead. There was no question. The way his neck was twisted, the catastrophic damage I'd caused, even before I looked closely. But then, I forced myself to look closer, my fear momentarily overridden by a chilling curiosity. What happened to him before I got here? He hadn't just been hit by my truck. His head. There was too much blood, and it was coming from more than just the injury I inflicted. There was a wound on the back of his head, deep and jagged, that hadn't been caused by rubber and gravel. It looked like he'd been struck, hard, by something heavy and blunt. He was already dying or dead when I arrived. This changed everything. It wasn't an accident I caused. It was a crime scene I had inadvertently driven through. I looked frantically around. The street was dark, the few overgrown houses invisible behind thickets of trees. No lights on, no dogs barking. Silence. A terrifying, oppressive silence that seemed to listen. My fiancée, Clara, was due to arrive tomorrow morning with the movers, bringing the rest of our belongings and our 2 cats. She thought I was just sleeping in the empty house tonight, waiting for them. She had no idea I was currently straddling a corpse. Call the police. Now. The voice of reason was faint, buried under the avalanche of panic. But another voice, cold and rational, whispered, "No, not yet. If I called, I'd be tied up in this for months. My truck, evidence. My statement scrutinized. The house sealed off. Our dream of a quick, quiet move-in shattered. And what if the person who did this was still nearby? What if they were watching, waiting for me to involve the police? This wasn't a big city where crimes disappear into the news cycle. This was a sleepy, remote town. I would be the story. The fear of the unknown assailant and the deep, selfish need to protect my new life ward inside me. Selfishness won. I had to move the body. I knew it was insane. I knew it was illegal. But the alternative, destroying our future before it started, felt even worse. I checked the time on my phone again, 1:23 a.m. I had perhaps 4 hours until dawn. I walked to the back of the U-Haul. I lowered the ramp, the heavy metal squeaking like a tortured animal. Inside, amidst the few boxes I'd brought for the first night, bedding, towels, snacks, was a long, heavy-duty tarp I'd bought for painting. I grabbed it. I walked back to the man. The stench was getting stronger. I forced myself to look at his face. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with close-cropped dark hair and a look of terrified confusion frozen on his features. His eyes were open, glassy. I reached out a tentative hand and gingerly patted down his pockets, looking for ID. Nothing that immediately gave away his identity. I unfolded the tarp and wrestled the man onto it. He was heavier than he looked, his weight sickeningly dead and inert. Dragging the body across the gravel made a horrible scraping sound, and every sound felt magnified 10 times in the stillness. I kept looking back at the dark windows of the house, convinced I would see a flicker, a movement, a reflection. Was someone watching me from the dark house I was about to call home? I finally got him to the edge of the porch. Now what? I couldn't leave him in the truck. I had to get him inside the house, just for the night. The house was completely empty. Bare floorboards, echoing hallways, dust sheets over the windows. The perfect empty canvas for a fresh start, and now the perfect temporary tomb. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open, revealing an inky black interior. I dragged the bundled body across the porch and into the front hall. The floorboards immediately groaned under the new, grim weight. I pulled him down the long hallway toward the back of the house, and then I saw the door. It was in the floor of the pantry, tucked away beneath a shelf of cobweb-dusted canning jars. A small, rusty latch on a square section of wood. A basement I didn't know existed. A surge of morbid relief, mixed with a fresh wave of terror, flooded me. This house is helping me. I pried the hatch open. A smell of damp earth, mildew, and something else, something metallic and old, wafted up. I shone my phone flashlight down. Concrete steps, leading to a small, unfinished root cellar. Perfect. It took all my strength to maneuver the body down the narrow, rickety steps. It was a horrible, intimate moment. The feel of his stiffening arm against my cheek, the cold clamminess of his clothes. When he finally thumped onto the dirt floor below, I almost retched. I backed up the steps, heart pounding a furious rhythm. I pulled the wooden hatch shut. The squeak of the latch sounded like a scream in the stillness. I stood there, gasping, hands covered in dirt and God knows what else. I had to clean up. The driveway, the porch, the hall. I had to make sure Clara, the movers, the police, anyone, would never suspect that our new home's foundation was now resting on a secret. I grabbed the hose from the side of the house, scrubbing the blood from the gravel and porch, diluting the evidence until it was nothing more than dark, damp patches. It took nearly an hour. The smell, though faint, seemed to cling to the air around me. I came back inside and looked at the pantry door. The floorboards were clean, but the memory was etched into the wood. I had a man, a victim of a previous crime, hidden beneath my feet. Who was he? Why was he killed here on my property just moments before I arrived? Was the killer watching me struggle with the body? And what other secrets did this old house hold that were dangerous enough to kill for? I locked the front door, turned off the high beams on the U-Haul, and sank onto the bare wooden steps of the main staircase. It was 3:45 a.m., too late to sleep, too early for the sun. I had come seeking peace, and I had found a grave. My own, because now I was an accessory. I had crossed a line, a very thick, blood-soaked line. I was trapped. The silence of the house no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a co-conspirator, waiting for me to make my next mistake. I looked at my hands, scrubbing them furiously on my jeans, and imagined the smooth, cold feel of that cellar door latch. Tomorrow, the movers would arrive. Clara would walk through that front door, eager to start our life. She would stand right over the pantry. How long could I keep this secret? And what would happen when the killer came looking for the body I had so conveniently deposited in the perfect hiding place? The worst part was knowing that I hadn't just hidden a body. I'd buried the truth, and I would be living right above it. My new house was no longer a home. It was a cage built on a lie, and the silence of the night had just sealed me inside. I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't just fixing up the house. I was covering up a murder, and the real renovation was just beginning. It was going to take much more than paint and plaster to cover the stain left tonight. Story 2. The first few weeks in the new house were supposed to be blissful noise. The cheerful scrape of sanding, the smell of fresh paint, the satisfying thud of boxes being unpacked. Instead, it was an echoing silence, only broken by the frantic, nervous hammering of my own heart. We hadn't been here a month, but I was already sleeping with a wrench under my side of the bed, a useless piece of metal against the growing dread. It all started the day we found the safe. It wasn't a standard, wall-mounted job. It was hidden beneath the loose floorboards in the upstairs linen closet, tucked into the joists. I had been ripping up the terrible yellow shag carpet, a crime against interior design, when my knee pressed a floorboard in the closet and it shifted with an unnerving sigh. Underneath, a heavy, squat black cube. Jackpot, right? Maybe the old owner left some antique gold coins? I joked to Maria, my hand already tracing the cold steel. She was less amused. Maria always saw the cloud, especially after the rough financial patch we'd just crawled out of. The safe was locked, naturally, but one side was slightly warped, dented inwards, as if someone had tried to smash it open with serious malice. We spent 3 days trying to crack it, using every YouTube tutorial imaginable. The fourth night, I got lucky with a massive industrial pry bar I borrowed from a contractor friend. The contents weren't gold. They were worse. Inside, jam-tight, was a single, thick oilskin ledger bound in worn leather. No coins, no jewelry, just names, dates, amounts, and a terrifyingly detailed system of codes. It looked like an accounting book for a small business. A very illegal small business. The kind that dealt in debt, drugs, and violence. This ledger was a map of local criminality, and the totals listed were astronomical. And right there, circled in red ink, was the address of this new house. We should have burned it right then. We should have called the police, dumped the thing in the deepest part of the reservoir, or shipped it to an anonymous news outlet. But we were stupid. We were curious, and honestly, we were scared of what calling the police would invite into our quiet, remote life. We tucked it back into the linen closet, secured the floorboard, and pretended the ledger didn't exist. That was our first mistake. Our second mistake was thinking we were alone. Tonight, the wind was howling through the eaves, making the old house sound like it was weeping. It was 2:45 a.m. I was downstairs, unable to sleep, scrolling through renovation ideas on my tablet, nursing a cold cup of coffee. Maria was asleep upstairs. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't the tentative tap of a lost tourist or a bored kid. It was a solid, deliberate, weighted sound that vibrated through the floorboards and silenced the wind. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. I froze, tablet clattering onto the counter. Who is it? It's almost 3 in the morning. I whispered into the darkness, even though I knew the sound wouldn't carry past the thick, closed front door. Knock, knock, knock. Closer this time, more insistent. The sound was coming from the side window, right next to the kitchen. I crept toward the window, hugging the wall. The curtains were thin, just temporary shears. I held my breath and peered through the lace. I couldn't see a face clearly, just a massive, dark silhouette standing right at the edge of the porch. A man. He was wearing a heavy, bulky jacket even though it wasn't that cold. And he wasn't looking at the door. He was looking directly into the window, right where I was standing. I instinctively recoiled, scrambling backward, my spine hitting the kitchen counter with a painful crack. How did he know I was here? Jack, I know you're in there, a voice called out. It was low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of emotion. "We need to talk about the bookkeeping. The man who lived here before you." He ran up a tab. "And when a client disappears, the debt travels with the property. It's a land lease agreement, you understand. A debt collector's policy." My blood ran cold. They weren't looking for the previous owner. They were looking for the ledger. And they were trying to scare us into handing it over. I scrambled for my phone, but then I realized, if I call the police, what do I tell them? A debt collector is here at 3 a.m. asking for a drug ledger I found hidden in my wall. That only cements the suspicion that I am somehow involved. I ran upstairs, 2 steps at a time, tripping over the loose rug at the landing. I burst into the bedroom. "Maria, wake up. We have a problem." "A big problem," I hissed, shaking her shoulder violently. She bolted upright, her eyes wide and confused in the dim moonlight filtering through the dusty window. What is it, Jack? Are the pipes leaking again?" "No, it's not the pipes. There's someone outside. They know about the safe." "The book?" I stammered, grabbing the wrench from under the mattress. "We need to move the book. Now." Maria's face went from sleepy confusion to stark terror. She clutched her nightgown. No, Jack. I told you we should have never touched it. Don't go near that closet. Don't you dare go near that closet." But it was too late. We heard the sickening sound from downstairs. Not a knock this time. A smash. The back patio door had just been shattered. He was inside. We scrambled out of bed. I pushed Maria toward the tiny second-floor bathroom. "Hide. Lock yourself in. Don't make a sound. I'm going to the closet. I need to get rid of the proof." I sprinted down the hall to the linen closet. My hands were shaking so violently I almost couldn't lift the floorboard. I ripped it up and reached down, feeling the cold steel of the safe. I pulled it out, struggling with the weight. Heavy footsteps were ascending the main staircase. They were slow, measured, and coming directly toward me. I knew I couldn't fight him. He was huge and I had a useless wrench. My only chance was to ditch the ledger somewhere impossible to find. The old chimney shaft. The empty water well. I hauled the safe back into the bedroom, closing the door quietly behind me. "Jack, where are you going?" "The bathroom," Maria whimpered from behind the locked bathroom door. "The safe is too heavy. I'm taking the book and tossing it out the window into the woods. Then we call the police." "Don't come out," I whispered frantically. I wrestled the ledger out of the safe. It was even heavier than I remembered, saturated with history. I looked toward the window. It was 3 stories down to the thick undergrowth. Perfect. That's when I saw the reflection in the glass. He was standing in the doorway, blocking my only exit. He must have moved incredibly quietly, maybe waiting in the shadows of the hallway for me to panic. He was even bigger up close, a menacing pillar of black fabric. He didn't have a gun. He had a wicked-looking, heavy crowbar, the tool of choice for forced entry and blunt trauma. Jack, you should have left things alone," the gravelly voice said, taking a slow step into the room. "That book is our collateral. I need it. You can't throw away our investment, can you?" I held the ledger tight against my chest. "Get out of my house. I don't know anything about that book or the man who lived here," I lied, my voice cracking. He smiled, a chilling, joyless expression. "Oh, but you do know him, Jack. You know him very well. You just don't know who he knew." He raised the crowbar, ready to swing. I prepared to dodge, to fight, to scream. And then the bathroom door burst open. Maria wasn't just hiding. She wasn't just scared. She had a small, antique revolver from her grandfather, one she kept hidden in a box of old scarves. She was holding it with 2 shaky hands, pointing it directly at the man's chest. "Get out, now!" she shouted, her voice shaking but surprisingly steady. The debt collector paused, crowbar held mid-swing. He looked from me, holding the book, to Maria holding the gun, and then he looked at me again, a strange, knowing look in his eyes. "It's a shame, Jack. All that trouble and you never looked at the names. You never saw the ledger was already balanced. The owner paid his debt. He paid it with your down payment. And he paid it to her," the man said, gesturing at Maria with his crowbar. My entire world stopped. I stared at Maria. Her hands were trembling, but her eyes held a cold, terrifying calculation I had never seen before. "The house was cheap for a reason, Jack. The bank didn't care about the ledger, but they cared about the collateral," the man said, lowering the crowbar slightly. "And the collateral was the new owner who would take the fall." Maria didn't hesitate. She didn't look at me. She just looked at the man. "Get out. You've said too much," she said, firing a single shot. The blast was deafening in the small room. The bullet didn't hit the man. It hit the wall an inch from his head. But it was enough. He scrambled backward, eyes wide, before turning and plunging back down the stairs. We listened as the man crashed through the shattered patio door and disappeared into the night. I stood there, gasping, holding the ledger. I looked at Maria. She was lowering the revolver, her face pale. "He was bluffing, Jack. He was a monster. I protected us," she whispered, her voice cracking now. But my mind was racing. The down payment, the strange, cheap price, her insistence on buying this specific, isolated house, the look the debt collector gave me. I slowly opened the ledger, my hands finally steady, and flipped through the pages. I didn't care about the names. I flipped to the final entries, the paid in full section, and there it was.
À signature.
M.A. Maria, and it wasn't a previous owner's ledger. It was her ledger. And the man downstairs wasn't a debt collector. He was an enforcer, and Maria had just betrayed her partner to get a fresh start with a cheap, bloody house. Who was that man, Maria? And whose ledger is this really? I asked, the words hollow and cold. She just looked at me, the smoking gun now resting on the floor. Her eyes were no longer terrified. They were calculating. "Welcome to the new house, Jack. What are you going to do now?" The silence of the house returned, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the deafening sound of my shattered future, and the horrifying realization that the real danger hadn't been standing outside our window. It had been sleeping right next to me all along. I was trapped in a house that was now not just a crime scene, but a conspiracy, and I was the unsuspecting final piece. Story 3. We were only looking for character. We found a cell. When we bought this sprawling, century-old new house, the listing called the layout eccentric. We called it perfect. My husband, Liam, a budding architectural historian, loved the confusing angles and the sheer impossibility of the central chimney structure. It jutted out oddly on the second floor, a huge mass of brick that seemed to steal almost 10 square feet from the master bedroom. Liam insisted it was a sign of early American craftsmanship. I insisted it was a waste of space. 3 weeks after moving in, while hanging a picture on the north wall of the master bedroom, I hit a spot that sounded wrong. Hollow, not the dull, firm resistance of lath and plaster, but a resonant thump, like hitting a drum. Liam grabbed his tiny LED flashlight and we spent an hour tracing the hollow section. It was nearly 7 feet tall and 3 feet wide, running parallel to the chimney stack. "It's a hiding space, priest hole, a secret library," Liam whispered, his eyes shining with pure historical glee. We spent the next day carefully prying the molding away. Underneath, someone had painstakingly concealed the seam of a narrow, floor-to-ceiling door, hidden by a layer of textured wallpaper that almost perfectly matched the rest of the room. It was brilliant craftsmanship, designed to fool anyone not looking for it. Using a borrowed screwdriver, we managed to force the ancient latch. The door scraped inward with a sound like tearing silk, releasing a puff of cold, stagnant air that smelled faintly of damp wood, dust, and something indescribably sweet and metallic. It wasn't a library. It was a tiny, bare room, maybe 4 feet deep, built right into the core of the house. There was a single, high, dust-caked vent near the ceiling, covered by mesh. The floor was rough, unfinished cement, and in the corner, almost invisible in the gloom, was a cot. A single, thin, dirty mattress on a metal frame. My stomach twisted. This wasn't historical charm. This was intentional confinement. There was nothing else. No books, no trinkets, no sign of who had used it or why, except for one thing. Scrawled into the plaster wall, just above where a person lying on the cot would rest their head, were a series of tally marks, hundreds of them. And beneath the marks, etched with frantic, deep scratches that looked like they were done with a fingernail, was one word: counting. We stared at the room for a long minute. Liam's excitement had evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. We need to call the police. This is recent. It feels wrong, I muttered, backing out of the tiny, claustrophobic space. Wait, no, look, Liam said, shining the light on the cement floor. Near the back wall, almost hidden by dust, was a faint discoloration in the cement. A dark, deep stain that looked suspiciously like dried blood. We closed the door, pushing the section of wall shut with a shuddering heave. We didn't bother replacing the molding. We just stood there, staring at the seam, the hidden room now a silent, breathing horror in the middle of our bedroom. We didn't call the police. We argued about it, whispering late into the night. Liam was terrified of the questions, the media, the house being sealed off. I was terrified of what or who had been in that room. We ultimately agreed to wait, to think. A disastrous decision driven by fear and inertia. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house sounded like that narrow door opening. I kept picturing the tally marks, the desperate scratch of someone counting the slow march of days. It was around 3 a.m. Liam was finally asleep beside me, his breathing deep and steady. I was staring at the ceiling, my eyes drawn to the wall where the hidden room lay, just feet away. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was a small sound, almost imperceptible. But in the oppressive silence of the new house, it was like a hammer blow to my eardrum. It was coming from inside the wall. I sat up instantly, adrenaline flooding my system. I held my breath, listening so hard my ears felt like they would burst. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. It sounded like something moving against the plaster, like a small animal trapped inside. A mouse. A rat. But the scratching was too deliberate, too high up, and it was followed by a sound that was absolutely, undeniably human. A whimper. Faint, choked, and quickly muffled. My blood turned to ice. I gently nudged Liam's shoulder. He only groaned and rolled over. I wasn't going to wake him properly. The sound was too delicate, too easily dismissed as the house settling. I slid out of bed, grabbing the heavy bedside lamp. My legs felt like rubber. I crept across the room, stopping directly in front of the hidden door seam. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Silence. The intense, suffocating silence of the night. I almost turned away, convincing myself it was the wind, the chimney draft, my own paranoia finally manifesting. Then it came again. Scrape, scrape, and this time a tiny, almost microscopic click. It wasn't inside the wall. It was behind the wall, inside the hidden room. Someone was in there. Someone had been in there the whole time, and we had locked them in. Or, far worse, someone had put someone in there after we found the room and locked it again. I fumbled with the light switch, flipping on the main overhead light. The harsh, yellow glow made the room look painfully ordinary, which only intensified the horror of the hidden seam. I had to check. I had to know. My hands found the loose section of molding we hadn't replaced. I used the brass base of the lamp to wedge into the door seam. It took excruciating effort, every movement feeling loud enough to wake the dead. Finally, the latch groaned, and the door slid open a crack. The air that rushed out this time was thick, sweet and heavy like spoiled meat and cheap perfume. I shone the lamp inside, blinding my eyes for a moment in the small, dark space. The cot was gone. The cement floor was scrubbed clean, but the tally marks still screamed from the back wall. And in the center of the tiny room, illuminated by my shaking light, was a person. It was a young woman. She was sitting upright, huddled in the corner, her knees drawn to her chest. She was bound tightly with thick industrial zip ties, her wrists behind her back, her ankles cinched together. A dirty gag was tied over her mouth, muffling her desperate attempts to breathe. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and frantic with terror and relief. She wasn't counting the days. She was still counting the minutes. I dropped the lamp. It clattered onto the floor, the light bulb shattering, plunging the room back into darkness, except for a sliver of weak moonlight from the window. Oh my God! Oh my God! Liam, wake up. There's someone in here? I screamed, scrambling backwards. The woman made a low, frantic noise against the gag, shaking her head violently, desperately trying to convey something other than terror. And that's when I heard the other sound. It wasn't a whimper. It was a low, guttural sigh of annoyance, coming from the doorway to the bedroom. I whirled around. Liam was standing there, not in his pajamas, but dressed in dark clothes, jeans, a heavy jacket, and work boots. He wasn't holding a wrench. He was holding a short, thick length of black rubber hose. You shouldn't have opened the door, honey. I was going to handle it in the morning, Liam said, his voice flat and disappointed, as if I had merely forgotten to take out the trash. I felt the blood drain from my face, my vision tunneling. Liam, what are you talking about? Who is that? He stepped fully into the light, blocking the exit. That, my dear, is the reason this new house was so eccentric and so cheap. It came with an amenity the previous owner couldn't let go of, and neither could I once I found out about it during the inspection. It was perfect for my little problem. He looked past me at the hidden door, then back at the terrified woman inside. She wasn't counting the days, Sarah. She was counting the visits. I only found her 3 days ago, right after you found the wall. I had to replace the cot, you know. It was getting messy. I told you I borrowed the hose from the contractor for plumbing repairs. I stumbled backward, hitting the opened edge of the hidden door. My breathing hitched. The sweet, metallic smell of the room now made horrifying, sickening sense. You put her in there. You kidnapped her. I choked out, unable to reconcile the loving, goofy husband I knew with this monster. Not kidnapped, rehomed. She was bothering a friend of mine, causing problems. I'm just helping out. And you nearly ruined the whole operation, he said, taking a slow step toward me, the black hose hanging loosely from his hand. We had a perfect system, a perfect, isolated new house. Why couldn't you just leave the eccentric wall alone? He reached for me. My mind screamed one thing: survival. I plunged into the dark, hidden room, slamming the door shut behind me, not caring about the gagged woman beside me. The heavy wall section thudded closed, but it didn't latch. I fumbled in the darkness, trying to find the tiny latch mechanism. My fingers brushed against the rigid, cold wall, the desperation of the bound woman a tangible, breathing presence beside me. Liam's massive weight slammed against the door from the outside. Sarah, don't be stupid. We can still fix this. We can both count the days together. Thud. Thud. The door was bowing inward, the flimsy lock rattling violently. I squeezed my eyes shut, realizing the horrifying truth. I wasn't trapped with a victim. I was trapped as a victim. And my new, eccentric house had become the last, darkest secret I would ever know. I scrabbled at the rough cement floor, trying to find anything. A loose stone, a shard of glass, anything to fight back. And my hand hit something small, smooth, and cold. The corner of the tiny, shattered bedside lamp bulb. The hidden room was shaking. Liam was about to break through. What was my husband truly capable of? And how far would he go to keep the eccentric room hidden forever? The clock on the bedside table ticked into 3:45 a.m., and the night was just getting started. Story 4. The realtor had described the new house's quirks as a unique sense of history and community spirit. What she meant was, there were weird, old, dried-up flowers hanging on the inside of every single window, and the neighbors, all half a mile away, refused to meet our eyes. We, my sister, Chloe, and I, moved in to get away from the city noise and the trauma of our mother's passing. We wanted quiet. We got creepy. The house itself was beautiful. A 1920s craftsman with rich wood trim and a massive, deep fireplace. It sat on 3 acres of thick, oppressive woods. It felt sturdy, safe, almost smug in its remoteness. This house was supposed to be our fortress. But the oddities started immediately. First, the flowers. Dried bundles of what looked like Queen Anne's lace and some kind of reddish root, tied with faded silk ribbon. They were tacked up high inside every window casing, even the tiny attic windows. When I started taking them down, Chloe stopped me. "Leave them, Sam. Maybe it's a local thing, like a welcoming gesture. Or keeping out bugs." My unease started a week after we moved in, right after I found the contract. It wasn't hidden well. It was shoved into the hollow space behind the old mantelpiece. It was printed on heavy, aged parchment paper, folded multiple times. It wasn't an official deed or lease. It was handwritten in tight, precise script, and the ink was dark and unsettlingly fresh. The title read, "The 12-Day Contract, Tenancy of the Sacred Plot." It outlined a series of 12 obligations that the current occupant, referred to only as the steward, must perform over 12 consecutive nights, starting on the first new moon after taking possession. If the obligations were completed, the steward was granted a year of peaceful tenure. If they failed, the contract stated that the steward would be reclaimed by the plot. The obligations themselves were terrifyingly vague. On day 1, the steward shall prepare the vessel. On day 5, the steward shall offer the blood pledge. On day 12, the steward shall accept the exchange. The last line of the contract was signed, not with a name, but with a complex symbol. 3 interwoven circles that looked suspiciously like the pattern of the dried flowers in the windows. My false sense of security evaporated like smoke. This wasn't local eccentricity. This was ritual. I didn't show Chloe. She was already fragile, dealing with grief. I shoved the contract back behind the mantelpiece and spent the next 3 days researching local cults, folklore, and symbols. Nothing matched. I told myself it was a harmless, elaborate prank by the previous owner, but I kept watching the sky, waiting for the new moon. 2 days ago, the sky went dark. The new moon arrived, and that first night, day 1, I was forced to face the reality. At 1 a.m., the lights flickered and died. Not just in our house, but the streetlights down the winding road. Everything was black. The silence was absolute. Then came the sound, a rhythmic, heavy thudding coming from deep in the woods behind the house. It was metallic, like someone swinging a massive iron weight against a tree. I was paralyzed in bed. Chloe was asleep in the room across the hall. I crept downstairs, grabbing the heaviest object I could find, a brass fireplace poker. I peered through the back window, holding the curtain edge. It was too dark to see anything, but the sound seemed to stop directly behind the house. Then I saw it. A single, small white pebble had been placed directly on the back step, just outside the sliding glass door. It wasn't there when I locked up earlier. It was a marker, a message. I knew with absolute certainty that this pebble was the vessel mentioned in the contract. It was small, unassuming, and utterly terrifying. The ritual had begun. Last night, day 2, the obligation was, the steward shall mark the perimeter. Around 2 a.m., the thudding started again, moving slowly around the property. And when dawn broke, I crept out and found them. 12 more white pebbles, spaced exactly equidistant around the edge of our property line, forming a perfect circle with the house at the center. The sense of being watched, of being enclosed, was suffocating. Tonight was day 3. The contract read, on day 3, the steward shall welcome the watcher. It was 2:30 a.m. Chloe was restless tonight, tossing and turning. I was sitting in the living room, staring at the darkened fireplace, the brass poker lying cold on the hearth. I didn't know what welcoming the watcher meant. Did I have to open the door? Leave a window unlocked? I was desperately afraid that, if I failed the obligation, something would happen to Chloe. Creak. The sound came from upstairs. Not the loud groan of old wood, but a soft, stealthy creak. It was the sound of weight being placed carefully on a floorboard. Right outside Chloe's bedroom door. My breath hitched. The watcher wasn't outside. They were already in the house. I gripped the poker, the cold brass cutting into my palm. I crept silently toward the stairs, every fiber of my body screaming for me to run, to hide, to scream. But I knew I couldn't leave Chloe. I reached the top landing. The hallway was pitch black. I could hear a faint, ragged sound coming from Chloe's room. Not a scream, but a labored whisper. I moved toward the door, my heart hammering. Was she hurt? Was she already gone? I pushed her door open, slowly. The room was bathed in pale moonlight from the window. Chloe was asleep in bed, motionless. But she wasn't alone. A figure was standing over her. Tall, gaunt, silhouetted against the weak light. They were wearing what looked like heavy, rough burlap robes, obscuring their face completely. They were holding something small and dark in their hands, their bodies slightly bowed over Chloe. My terror finally broke the paralysis. "Get out!" I roared, raising the poker above my head. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. They simply finished what they were doing. They gently laid the object on Chloe's pillow, right beside her head. It was another dried flower arrangement, identical to the ones on the windows, tied with the same faded ribbon. And then, the figure simply turned and walked toward the bedroom door, directly toward me. I swung the poker blindly, fueled by pure adrenaline and rage. It connected with a solid thwack against their shoulder. There was no sound of pain, no grunt, just the sound of the heavy, rough burlap scraping against itself as they pushed past me, knocking me hard against the doorframe. I scrambled backward, falling to the floor. I watched as the figure moved with unnatural speed and silence down the hallway. They didn't run down the main stairs. They vanished toward the back of the house, toward the small, narrow staircase leading to the attic. I struggled to my feet and ran back into Chloe's room. She was still sleeping, deeply, unnaturally still. I checked her pulse. Fast, but steady. I looked at the pillow. The new flowers sat there, a chilling trophy. I ran to the wall where the attic stairs were. The pull-down hatch was slowly swinging shut. I grabbed the cord, pulling it down again with a desperate rattle. I climbed the dusty, creaking stairs. The attic was empty, vast, and silent. The only light came from the dried flowers taped to the tiny windows. How did they get in? And where did they go? The attic had no other exits. I looked down at the wooden floorboards near the chimney. They were covered in a fine layer of soot and dust. But there, running across the center of the floor, was a single, clean line. A streak that looked exactly like a heavy burlap robe had just been dragged across it. It led to a small, low-hanging door built into the back wall, hidden by some forgotten insulation. I knew instantly. That door led to the roof or maybe a secret space between the walls. The ritualists had built their access right into the structure. This new house wasn't a fortress. It was a carefully constructed trap. I didn't open the door. I ran back downstairs, bursting into the living room. I had to call the police. I had to get Chloe out. I grabbed the cell phone. No signal, of course. The remoteness was part of the contract. I looked at the fireplace, at the cold, empty hearth. I stared at the mantelpiece, where the contract lay hidden. The figure's action, placing the flower on Chloe's pillow, was the obligation for day 3. The steward shall welcome the watcher. I hadn't welcomed them. They had come to claim the welcome. They were watching us, and they had just branded Chloe. I picked up the brass poker. I looked at the front door. Outside was the darkness of the woods, where 12 white pebbles marked the perimeter. Inside was a silent house, where a stranger had just walked over my sleeping sister. What was day 4's obligation? The steward shall observe the silence. And what would happen to Chloe if I failed to keep it? I knew I had to get the contract, read ahead, and try to stop the ritual before day 12, before the final, terrifying exchange. I was locked in a contract I never signed, and I had 9 nights left to save my sister. Story 5. Moving into the new house felt like stepping onto a stage. It was everything we'd wanted, mid-century modern, all sharp angles, and floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around the entire living area. It was light, airy, and utterly exposed. My wife, Leah, loved the views. I, however, started to realize that the views weren't just for us. The neighborhood was weirdly sparse. 3 other houses visible through the dense, tall pines, all the same style, all seemingly abandoned or perpetually dark. The neighbors never waved, never acknowledged our moving trucks, and if we saw them outside, which was rare, they'd duck back inside instantly. It gave the whole area a feeling of a carefully maintained set piece. The trouble started on the 4th night. We were celebrating with pizza and cheap champagne, sitting on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived yet. I kept feeling a cold draft, even though the triple-pane glass was sealed tight. Then I saw it, a small, perfectly round hole in the glass of the main living room window. It was about the size of a dime, situated low down near the frame, where the glass was slightly tinted for privacy. It wasn't cracked. It was drilled. Someone had used a diamond tip cutter or something similar to excise a neat surgical hole. A ventilation hole. Maybe it's some sort of old passive cooling system, Leah suggested nervously, running her finger over the smooth edge. But I knew better. It was too precise, too deliberate. I patched it with heavy-duty clear packing tape and didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about that hole. Peephole. The next morning, I found another one. This time, it was in the master bedroom, high up, directly above the headboard of where our bed would eventually go. This one was even smaller, almost invisible. I had to climb onto a box to see it. I looked through the tiny aperture, expecting to see dense woods. Instead, I saw the roofline of the nearest neighbor's house, maybe 300 yards away, and the subtle, shiny glint of what looked like reflective glass in their attic window. My blood ran cold. They weren't just watching us casually. They had engineered a specific line of sight into our bedroom, using the high window as a surveillance point. I showed Leah. She broke down. "We have to call the police, Ken. This isn't just creepy, it's criminal." We did call. The local sheriff drove out, took a look at the holes, and shrugged. "This area's old, folks. These modernist places have weird ventilation. Could be a squirrel, could be old cabling. Just patch 'em up." He looked at the neighbor's house, which remained utterly dark and silent. No one home over there, anyway. Been empty for years, far as I know. He left, and we were alone again, standing in our beautiful glass house that now felt like a fishbowl. We tried to block the view. We covered the drilled windows with towels, then heavy cardboard. But the paranoia wasn't about the holes anymore. It was about the windows we couldn't cover. Every floor-to-ceiling panel was now a gaping weakness. 3 days later, the real escalation began. It was 1:15 a.m. I was downstairs trying to work up the nerve to install temporary blinds, while Leah was taking a shower upstairs. The only sound was the low, persistent hum of the refrigerator. And then, I heard the sound outside. It was a delicate, rhythmic clicking. Not loud, but incredibly close. I pressed myself against the interior kitchen wall and looked out one of the lower windows, straining my eyes in the oppressive, moonless darkness. I couldn't see the source, but the clicking noise seemed to move. Slowly, methodically. It sounded like the subtle, mechanical whir of an old film camera winding its spool, followed by a faint, soft click shutter. Over and over. My mind raced. Were they taking pictures? Of what? Of us? Of Leah in the shower? I frantically grabbed my phone, ready to dial 911, and took a step closer to the window. The clicking stopped. The silence returned, thick and instant. Then, I heard a new sound, a soft, almost inaudible thump coming from the roof, directly above the dining room. I crept to the dining room. The ceiling here was vaulted, reaching up maybe 20 feet. There were no access points, no skylights. The thump sounded like something heavy and soft had just been placed on the roof. I ran upstairs to the master bedroom, where the sound would be closer. I pushed open the door and stopped dead. The room was empty. Leah was gone. The bathroom door was open. The shower was still running, steam curling out into the cold air. Her bathrobe lay discarded on the floor. Her wedding ring sat neatly on the counter by the sink. But Leah wasn't there. Leah! Leah! I screamed, running into the bathroom. I checked the closet, the tiny linen cupboard. Nothing. My eyes fell on the high, tiny peephole in the window, the one I'd taped over. The tape was peeled back, dangling uselessly. I looked through the hole. It was pointed directly at the empty spot above where our bed would be. Then I looked at the bathroom window. It was an opaque, textured glass for privacy, but it was wide open. Just a crack, maybe 4 inches, but enough. Enough for air, enough for sound, enough for something else. I pressed my face against the glass of the open window, looking down. Below was the thick, unkempt lawn and then the drop-off to the woods. And there, partially hidden by the shadow of the house, were 2 small footprints in the damp earth. They were small, delicate, and not made by Leah's bare feet. They looked like the tread of thin, rubber-soled shoes. I looked back up to the roof. Thump. Drag. The sounds were definitely coming from up there now. Did someone come in through the roof? Or did they take Leah out through the roof? The thought was insane, but the emptiness of the room screamed that it was true. I raced back downstairs, tearing through the kitchen. I threw open the back door and ran into the yard. I followed the house line, scanning the roof. It was too dark. I couldn't see a thing. I backed up, looking for a ladder. There was an old, rickety aluminum ladder chained to the shed. I fumbled with the chain, my hands slick with sweat, the cheap padlock refusing to yield. I finally kicked the shed door hard, shattering the rusted hinge, and grabbed the bolt cutters I remembered seeing inside. Snip! The chain broke with a sharp, echoing sound. I dragged the ladder to the back of the house, setting it against the gutter. As I started climbing, I looked across the woods toward the neighbor's house. The dark, silent house the sheriff said was empty. And tonight, for the first time, a light was on. A single, weak, yellowish light burning in the attic window, right where I had seen the metallic glint earlier. As I climbed higher, reaching the eaves, the light in the neighbor's house flickered, then went out. I reached the roofline. It was flat, covered in heavy tar paper, and lying in the center, glinting wetly in the faint light, was a thin, heavy-duty fiberglass rope tied to a ventilation stack. It dropped down directly over the open bathroom window, and next to the rope, perfectly centered on a patch of clean tar, was a small, high-definition video camera encased in a weatherproof shell. It was running. A tiny red LED glowed a constant, ominous warning. The camera was positioned to capture the entire back wall of the house. It was pointed at the ground. I crept forward and looked over the edge of the roof. Directly beneath me, pressed against the foundation in the narrowest part of the shadow, was a small camouflage tent. It was just big enough for one person. And sticking out from under the tent flap, I could see the worn, rubber-soled toe of a shoe. I didn't need to look inside. I knew the clicking noise. I knew the footprints. I knew the surveillance. I scrambled back down the ladder, heart pounding, adrenaline mixing with pure, paralyzing terror. I had to get away from the house. I ran to the main road, not looking back. I ran toward the one place I knew had a light on just moments ago. The neighbor's house. I burst through the overgrown gate, heading for the front porch. I hammered on the heavy oak door. "Hello, call 911. My wife is missing. I'm being watched." I hammered again and again. Silence. I looked up at the attic window. Dark. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw the small brass plate nailed next to the doorbell. It wasn't a nameplate. It was an old security warning, half rusted but still legible. Property managed by the Northwood Tenants Association. And below that, in smaller print, all glass houses are monitored for resident safety. Suddenly, the silent, empty houses and the aloof neighbors made horrifying sense. They weren't ignoring us. They were all part of it. They were the surveillance network. And Leah wasn't just taken by a lone stalker. She was absorbed by the entire community. I felt something cold and hard press into the small of my back. "You shouldn't have broken the protocol, Ken. You were supposed to stay inside the glass. You were supposed to let us watch." A quiet, woman's voice whispered from the darkness behind me. I froze, knowing my beautiful, exposed new house had merely been a prop in a much larger, darker performance. Where was Leah now? And what was the horrifying resident safety protocol for a steward who left the stage? The truth was hiding right there in the open, and I had walked right into the frame. Story 6. The basement was the deciding factor for us buying the new house. It wasn't the usual dank, spider-infested crawl space. It was a massive, clean concrete slab, almost a sub-level floor, with high ceilings and its own separate exterior access door leading up to the back garden. My partner, Ben, a passionate musician, immediately saw it as his perfect soundproof recording studio. We moved in during a heat wave. The first 2 weeks were spent sweating, painting, and dragging down acoustic foam panels. The basement was cool, quiet, and felt like a sanctuary, until I found the anomaly. It was hidden behind a stack of unused cinder blocks, near a section of the wall where the concrete looked unnaturally smooth. When I tugged on one of the blocks, the whole stack shifted, revealing a small, recessed metal hatch, maybe 6 inches square, with a heavy, rusted latch. "Look at this, Ben. Maybe a time capsule. Or where the old owner hid his gold," I joked, tapping the hatch.
Ben grunted, soldering a wire.
"Just cover it up, babe. We've got too much to do before the heat breaks." But I couldn't leave it. That night, after Ben was asleep upstairs, I went back down with a screwdriver and a can of WD-40. The latch squealed in protest, but finally gave. The hatch opened onto nothing but pitch blackness. It smelled stale, metallic, and faintly sweet, like overripe chemicals. I shone my phone light in. It was a narrow, vertical shaft that dropped maybe 15 feet, ending in a concrete floor. A small, rusted ladder was bolted to one side. It wasn't a time capsule. It was a service tunnel. Why would a suburban house need a secret, deep service tunnel with no obvious purpose? The next day, I brought it up to the local construction guy who was fixing our roof. He eyed the house, then the basement, and his smile vanished. "Ma'am, you got yourself a real old-school place here. Lots of houses built in the 30s had extra drainage features. Leave it alone, seal it up. You don't want the trouble that kind of hole brings." He took his money and drove off fast, leaving me with a growing knot of dread. I didn't seal it up. Instead, I started watching the house. I checked the hatch every morning. The latch would be exactly where I left it. The tunnel would be silent and dark. Until tonight. It was 2 a.m. I was upstairs, trying to sleep, but the oppressive quiet of the basement was keeping me awake. Ben's studio, my sanctuary. The words mocked me. Click, clack. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. It was coming from downstairs. A delicate, metallic sound, like the sound of that rusted latch being carefully, slowly opened. Inajd Ben. He was dead to the world, exhausted from mixing tracks. I slid out of bed, grabbing the baseball bat we kept behind the door. I crept down the stairs. The basement door was slightly ajar, casting a thin wedge of inky blackness onto the kitchen floor. I pushed it open slowly. The basement was cold, dark, and quiet. No music equipment was touched. But then I heard it. A sound that chilled me to the bone. Whispering. Deep, low, and rhythmic, echoing faintly from the far corner of the room. The corner where the cinder blocks lay. I held the bat tight and moved toward the sound, pressing myself against the newly painted drywall. The whispering wasn't coming from the basement itself. It was coming from down the shaft. I reached the recessed hatch. It was wide open. The latch was pulled back, and shining up from the absolute blackness below was a single, weak beam of light, bobbing slightly. I crouched down, heart pounding. The whispering was louder now. It wasn't English. It sounded like a rapid, harsh dialect I didn't recognize, laced with terms that sounded like numbers and codes. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of the faint words and the rhythmic thudding that was accompanying the voices. And then a head appeared in the shaft. A man's face, dark, sweaty, and heavily scarred, peered up into the empty basement. His eyes, squinting in the dim light, swept across the room. He didn't see me, pressed into the shadow beside the furnace. He was quickly followed by a second man, younger, struggling with a heavy duffel bag that he hoisted up and dropped onto the concrete floor with a muffled thump. The first man spoke, this time in perfectly clear, cold English, his voice resonating slightly in the concrete chamber. All right, let's stick to the schedule. 2 minutes to load and confirm, then back to the rail line. This house is just the transfer point. Not the end destination, the transfer point. My new house, my dream home, was a stop on a drug or contraband route. The service tunnel wasn't drainage. It was an escape route. A clandestine delivery chute leading to a hidden network, likely connected to old railway lines or storm drains far below. I watched, frozen in place, as the two men swiftly began their work. They opened the heavy duffel bag. Inside wasn't clothes or equipment. It was packed tight with what looked like vacuum-sealed bricks of white powder. Cocaine, heroin, something worse. They weren't taking things out. They were putting things in. They were using Ben's soundproof studio as a cache. A third figure climbed up, carrying a heavy tool chest. He moved to the back wall and began removing a seemingly permanent section of the acoustic foam paneling we had just painstakingly installed. Behind the foam was a pre-cut section of drywall, held in place by magnets. Hurry up, it's 2:05. The night guard will be making his rounds in 3 minutes. The first man snapped. The third man pulled the panel off, revealing a tight, square hole cut into the wall. He took the bricks of powder and began stacking them meticulously inside the cavity. They were filling the walls of my beautiful new recording studio with illegal narcotics. We weren't the owners of this house. We were the unwitting custodians of a syndicate's secret stash. My entire body was shaking. If I made a sound, if they saw me, Ben and I were dead. I was holding a baseball bat against 3 organized criminals who were clearly operating on a ruthless schedule. I needed to call the police, but my phone was upstairs, and the only way out was past them. The first man finished checking the inventory. He looked at his watch, a heavy, expensive-looking piece of jewelry. "All right, the house is clean. Lock the stash, secure the hatch. We're out." The third man secured the magnetic panel, replacing the acoustic foam over it. The basement looked exactly as it had before, except for the thousands of dollars of narcotics hidden in the drywall. The first man turned his back to me and moved toward the hatch. The second man, the one who carried the bag, bent down to grab the empty duffel bag, and as he stood up, he paused, his eyes fixed on something directly behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I knew what it was. In my rush down the stairs, I must have kicked the basement door. It had swung slightly further open. The second man's eyes narrowed. He slowly pointed a gloved finger past my shoulder. "Boss, the door. It wasn't open this far when we came up." The leader spun around instantly. His eyes, sharp and predatory, fixed on the ajar door, then swept across the empty space between me and the furnace. I pressed harder into the corner, but it was too late. My breath hitched, a tiny, involuntary gasp, and the leader's head snapped toward the sound. He saw me. His hand went instantly to the inside of his jacket. Not for a phone, for a gun. "Who's there? Show yourselves," he barked, his voice no longer a whisper, but a loud, terrifying command that bounced off the concrete walls. I lifted the bat, ready to swing blindly and run for the stairs. "Don't move," he yelled, taking a step toward me. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. Not the overhead lights, just a single, powerful, brilliant work lamp Ben had set up near his mixing desk. It cast a spotlight right on the leader's face, momentarily blinding him. I took the chance and swung the bat with all my strength. I aimed for the gun in his hand, but it hit his wrist with a sickening crack. The gun clattered onto the concrete. Before the others could react, I sprinted past the furnace toward the stairs, knocking over a can of paint in my haste. I reached the top landing, slamming the heavy wooden door shut and throwing the deadbolt. The men were already slamming against the door. I screamed for Ben, shaking him awake violently. "They're in the basement. Criminals. Drugs. We have to go. Now." Ben woke up disoriented, looking at me like I was insane. What are you talking about, Mel?" Crack. A splintering sound from the door. They were kicking it down. I grabbed Ben's keys and dragged him toward the bedroom door. "The back wall, Ben. They've hidden something in the back wall of the studio. We can't stay." We burst into the hallway. I shoved Ben ahead of me toward the front door. Smash! The basement door splintered open. I heard footsteps thundering onto the main floor. We raced outside, scrambling into my car. As I tore down the driveway, I looked back. 3 figures were standing in the open doorway, lit by the weak porch light. The leader was holding his injured wrist, his eyes burning with lethal fury. And then I saw the light again. That single, powerful work lamp in the basement window. It wasn't just shining on the leader. It was shining on the hatch. And someone was peering out of the small shaft, having just come up from the tunnel. A fourth man. He had an oily rag in his hand and was calmly wiping down the edge of the hatch. He looked up at the departing car, not with surprise, but with quiet, grim satisfaction. How many people were using this house? Was the delivery schedule about to change? And had the fourth man seen the license plate, sealing our fate to this deadly transfer point forever? The house was silent now, but it was waiting for the next scheduled drop-off, and I knew we had just earned a permanent, lethal spot on their itinerary. Story 7. We didn't buy the new house, we bought the quiet. After 10 years of urban apartment living, the silence here, miles from anything, felt like a luxury. It was a small, unassuming ranch-style place, built low to the ground, with a single heavily reinforced steel door in the back of the garage. The previous owner, an elderly man named Mr., Henderson had been insistent about it. That door stays locked, always. It leads to the boiler room. Don't ever go in there unless it's an emergency. He'd instructed my husband, Mark, during the final walkthrough. He handed Mark a single key, unlike any other key we possessed. A long, heavy key with a distinct, faded blue head. It's the only one. Guard it with your life. Mark, being meticulous, immediately hid the blue key. He told me he'd found the perfect spot, somewhere neither I nor anyone else would accidentally find it. I remember scoffing. Why all the drama over a boiler room? The first 3 months were peaceful. Then, tonight, the silence broke. It was 1 a.m. We were both startled awake by a sound that wasn't a creak or a thump. It was a piercing, synthetic screech, followed by a frantic, rapid clanging, vibrating up through the foundation and into our bed. What was that? The furnace, Mark mumbled, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The sound was coming from the back of the house, specifically the garage, and specifically the boiler room. We ran to the garage. The screeching had stopped, but the metallic clanging was now louder, more violent. It sounded like someone was trapped inside the thick steel door and was pounding on it with something heavy and hard. Oh God, Henderson said it was just a boiler. Is it some kind of pressure release? I stammered, my voice shaking. Mark pressed his ear to the cold steel. He went white. That's not machinery, Jen. That's a human being. Someone is locked in there. We hammered on the door. Hello? Who's there? A frantic, muffled voice screamed back. We couldn't make out the words, just the sheer, panic-stricken volume. Mark grabbed his utility flashlight and pointed it at the lock. It was a massive, old-fashioned tumbler lock, the kind that only opened with the single blue key. The key. The blue key. Where is it, Mark? I demanded, adrenaline making my voice razor-sharp. Mark stared blankly at the lock, then back at the door. His face went a terrifying shade of gray. I can't remember, he whispered. I hid it so well. I can't remember the exact spot. The pounding intensified. Now there was a rhythmic, desperate crack that sounded like the metal was beginning to give way. Mark began tearing apart the garage, throwing boxes, searching shelves, a frantic energy possessing him. I thought it was under the workbench. No, wait. Was it behind the old paint cans? I joined the search, my mind racing. We had to find that key. Now, the man inside sounded desperate, like he only had minutes left. Why was Mr. Henderson so insistent on keeping that room locked? And who was pounding for their life inside our house? The walls of the garage were lined with storage shelves. We started ripping off everything, old ski gear, toolboxes, dusty camping supplies. The search was pointless. It was a massive room, and Mark's perfect spot was too perfect. Think, Mark, think. When you hid it, what were you thinking? What was your connection? I pleaded, grabbing his shoulders. He closed his eyes, fighting back panic. I was thinking of something safe, something boring, something I'd never touch unless I had to. Boring. What's boring? I yelled. He pointed to a small, unassuming cupboard above the laundry sink. The paperwork, the manual for the water heater. That was boring. I wrenched open the cupboard. Inside, stacks of warranty cards, bills, and the thick, multilingual manual for the high-efficiency water heater. I ripped the manual out. It was empty, just the manual. The metallic cracking sound from the door was louder now, followed by a choked scream. The air suddenly smelled metallic, like ozone and old oil. He's running out of time, Mark. We need to find something to break this lock, I cried, scrambling back to the workbench. We grabbed every tool we had. Sledgehammers, heavy wrenches, a crowbar. We assaulted the heavy steel lock. Clang. Bang. Crunch. The lock was immovable. It was built into the door frame, a fortress mechanism designed for exactly this kind of assault. We were making noise, wasting time, and failing. Crack. A fresh, deeper tear sounded in the metal door, and through the new crack, a thin, reddish liquid began to seep out, pooling slowly on the concrete floor. Blood. The trapped person was hurt. Badly. The key, Jen. Think about the key. Mark suddenly gasped, his voice tight. It was blue. I hid it with the blue stuff. Blue stuff. We looked around the garage. Paint cans. Blue tape. A small, beat-up plastic box holding ancient videotapes. I ran to the videotape box. Tearing it open, I found old VHS tapes of our vacations. The box itself was blue plastic. I flipped it over. Nothing. I ran to the blue paint cans. I unscrewed the lids, shining my light inside. Just sticky blue paint. Mark was now tearing at the flimsy acoustic paneling on the ceiling, desperate. I swear, I put it with the blue. I put it with the blue. Then I looked at the laundry sink again. Specifically, the blue-dyed box of laundry detergent pods. Tide. I ripped the lid off the heavy plastic tub. Inside, nestled among the small, soft blue pods, was the heavy, brass key with the faded blue head. I found it. I found it. I screamed, clutching the key. Mark grabbed it, his hand shaking violently, and thrust it into the massive lock. He turned it. Click. Thunk. The sound of the lock disengaging was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. He yanked the steel door open. The sight that greeted us was worse than anything I could have imagined. The room was small, maybe 8 by 8 feet, lined with rusted steel pipes and a monstrous ancient boiler. But that wasn't the horror. The horror was the person inside. It wasn't a man. It was a teenage girl, barely 16, wearing simple cotton clothes. She wasn't just trapped. She was chained. Heavy iron shackles were bolted to the pipes and cinched around her ankles and wrists, holding her spread-eagled against the far wall. She was covered in blood, but the blood wasn't fresh. It was dried, old, and thick. She was pale, skeletal, clearly having been there for days, maybe weeks. Her frantic clanging wasn't an escape attempt. She was shaking the chains, desperately trying to get our attention. The new blood on the floor was from the friction of the iron cutting into her already raw skin. But the worst part, the terrifying, sickening detail, was her eyes. They weren't focused on us. They were fixed on the boiler. The old boiler was running. The pressure gauge was pegged in the deep red zone, and etched into the thick, rusty casing of the boiler, scraped crudely into the metal, was a name, Henderson. Please, please, the valve. He set the valve. The girl croaked, her voice barely audible. The pressure is going to blow. He set the pressure. Mark didn't hesitate. He scrambled past the girl, toward the massive, steaming boiler. He frantically searched for the pressure release valve. I stood in the doorway, paralyzed, staring at the girl, then at the key in my hand. Mr. Henderson hadn't given Mark the key to protect the boiler room. He had given it to him to keep it locked. This wasn't a boiler room. It was a prison. And the explosive pressure was the former owner's final, cruel farewell to his victim and his new house. Mark found a huge, heavy red wool valve and began twisting it counterclockwise, straining with the force. The rusty metal screamed in protest. The girl was sobbing now, whispering something I couldn't understand. I bent down to her, trying to find a way to get the shackles off. They were rusted and tight. The key. Did he tell you about the key? I asked frantically. She shook her head weakly. No key, just the code. He said if the new tenants didn't open the door in time, the house would cleanse itself. Mark grunted, finally getting the valve to move. The pressure gauge began to drop slowly, agonizingly slowly out of the red zone. Suddenly, the boiler let out a final, ear-splitting shriek. A plume of superheated steam hissed out from a cracked pipe near the girl's head. The girl screamed, closing her eyes, expecting the final blast. Mark kept twisting. The gauge dropped into the yellow, then finally, mercifully, into the green. The frantic hissing subsided. We were safe. For now. We had a terrified, injured hostage chained in our boiler room, and a house with a past far darker than we ever imagined. Mark looked at the girl, then at the thick chains. The shackles. They need a different key, Jen. A smaller, different key, he said, his voice exhausted and hollow. I looked back at the laundry sink cupboard. The water heater manual lay open on the floor. I picked it up again, feeling the thick pages. And this time, I noticed it. A slight discoloration on the blue schematics inside the manual. A stain carefully placed. I peeled back the page. Taped behind the technical drawings was a small, delicate silver key. The key to the shackles. Mr. Henderson's instructions, his warnings, his keys. They weren't about preventing a disaster. They were about timing it perfectly. He wanted us to find the girl, but only when the boiler was ready to explode, forcing us to choose between saving the girl and saving our lives. Who was this girl? And what was the terrifying emergency that only the blue key could solve? We had opened one door, but 1,000 new, more dangerous doors had just swung wide open in our new house. Story 8. I knew buying a new house out here, 40 miles from the nearest town, was a risk to my sanity. But I needed the silence. I needed the blank slate after the divorce. My therapist, Dr. Vance, had been very clear. You need stability, Anna, routine, and peace. The house was perfect. Small, modern, and utterly exposed to the endless wilderness. No immediate neighbors. Just pines and quiet. My paranoia started with the photographs. I'd inherited a few boxes of framed photos from my grandmother after she passed. I'd set them out on the mantelpiece in the living room. Sepia-toned portraits of stoic relatives, vacation snaps from the 1950s, all the normal detritus of a long family life. I was unpacking the kitchen on the third day when I noticed it. A small, silver-framed portrait of my grandfather, taken during the war. It had been moved. I remember placing it firmly in the center of the mantelpiece, perfectly aligned with the edge. Now it was nudged maybe 3 inches to the left, slightly crooked, the floor settling. A draft, I told myself, quickly straightening it. The next day it happened again. Not the same photo, but a completely different one, the wedding portrait of my parents. It was face down on the polished wood. I must have knocked it when I dusted. I muttered aloud, but I hadn't dusted. I hadn't even been in the living room since breakfast. The anxiety escalated the first week. Every time I left a room, something would be subtly changed. The bathroom door would be left slightly ajar when I swore I had closed it. A kitchen knife would be placed on the wrong side of the drawer divider. Small, maddening details that made me question my memory. I called Dr. Vance. Anna, this is common. You're isolated, you're stressed. You're looking for evidence of the chaos you just left behind. This is just classic confabulation, he explained, his voice calm over the static-laced phone line. Trust your routine, not your feelings. I tried. I started taking pictures of the rooms before I left them. Documentary evidence. My new routine was recording my sanity. This is where the terror began to truly set in. It was 1:30 a.m. I woke up to a faint, rhythmic sound coming from the living room. It sounded like the soft tap-tap-tap of metal on glass. I slid out of bed, grabbing the heavy, old-fashioned flashlight I'd bought for emergencies. The house was cold and silent otherwise. I crept toward the living room entrance. I stopped just inside the doorway, shining the beam around the dark space. A taping sound. The sound was coming from the mantelpiece, specifically from the row of framed family photographs. I shone the light directly at the frames, and I saw it, the silver-framed portrait of my grandfather. The glass was lightly fogged over, condensation from the cold night, and someone or something had traced a single word into the condensation with a fingernail or a piece of metal. The word was stop. My scream caught in my throat. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the polished floor, casting a mad, spinning light show across the walls and ceiling before settling under the couch. Who is in my house? I scrambled for my phone, my hands shaking violently, and ran back into the bedroom. I locked the door, throwing the deadbolt and jamming a chair under the handle. I called 911. The call failed. No signal. The remote location was finally claiming its price. I ran to my documented evidence. The photo album on my dresser filled with images I'd taken over the last few days. I flipped frantically to the latest picture of the mantelpiece, taken just before I went to bed. The images were clear. The condensation wasn't there. The word wasn't there. The photos were perfectly straight. But then I flipped back 3 days, to the day I first noticed the slight shift in my grandfather's photo. I had zoomed in on the picture of the mantelpiece I took that morning, and there, faintly, almost invisible to the naked eye, a tiny, subtle scratch on the polished wood of the mantelpiece, right where the photo had been resting. I grabbed the picture and ran back to the locked bedroom door, shining the phone's light on it. Top! A single, faint sound came from the other side of the door. Just one. Who is there? Show yourself, I shouted, my voice hoarse with terror. Silence. I looked back at the photograph of the mantelpiece, 3 days old. I zoomed in further on the scratch. It wasn't just a scratch. It looked like the faint, deliberate carving of a tiny symbol. 3 horizontal lines crossed by a vertical one. Like a microscopic gate. I ran to the closet, grabbing the emergency flare gun I'd bought for deep wood survival. This was survival now. I had to get out. I couldn't trust the door, but the bedroom window was large, low, and led straight to the patio. I threw open the window, the cold night air rushing in. I climbed out onto the patio, not bothering to close the glass behind me. I ran across the lawn, looking back at the dark silhouette of the new house. And then I stopped. I hadn't locked the front door today. I never locked the front door during the day. I told myself it was because I was still moving in, going in and out. But the truth was, I had started to forget. Was someone coming in during the day? Moving the photos? Writing on the glass at night? I kept running until I reached the edge of the thick pine woods. I huddled behind a massive, ancient tree, shivering violently, the flare gun heavy and useless in my hand. I waited there for what felt like hours. The moon, finally high enough, cast long, distorted shadows of the trees across the yard. I watched the house, and that's when I saw it. A faint, soft glow emanating from the living room window, like a single, flickering candle. I started crawling back toward the house, staying low in the shadows. When I reached the patio, I peered through the large, uncurtained living room window. The room was still dark, but on the mantelpiece, right in front of the framed photographs, was a small, lit tea light candle. It was casting a weak, dancing light onto the portraits, and standing directly in front of the mantelpiece, staring at the pictures, was a figure. It was tall and thin, wearing what looked like my own long silk nightgown. Their hair was long, dark, and wild. I raised the flare gun, my finger tightening on the trigger. Get away from my house. The figure slowly turned, and in the flickering candlelight, I saw the face. It was my face. Not a doppelganger, not a stranger. It was me, but wild-eyed, pale, and completely focused on the photographs. The eyes were vacant, fixed. The other me slowly lifted a piece of sharp metal, maybe a broken segment of a picture frame, and leaned forward. They meticulously scratched another letter into the condensation on the glass of my grandfather's photo. The word now read, "Stop I." I staggered backward, dropping the flare gun with a clatter onto the patio. My mind fractured. I was seeing things. I was having a psychotic break. Then, I looked at my own hands. They were bare. I was wearing my pajamas, a thick flannel pair. The silk nightgown was still folded in a drawer. I looked back at the window. The figure was gone. The candle was out. The room was dark. I crept back inside through the open window. The house was deathly cold. I ran to the mantelpiece, fumbling for the flashlight I dropped earlier. I found it, shining the beam frantically on the glass. The word was gone. The condensation had evaporated. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for one thing. I looked at the silver-framed portrait of my grandfather. The brass stand on the back of the frame, which held it upright, was now bent and slightly broken. The perfect piece of sharp metal used for scratching the glass. I ran to the bedroom. I checked my silk nightgown drawer. It was empty. I checked the closet. I found the pair of heavy, outdoor work boots I'd bought a week ago. They were muddy. The mud looked fresh. I looked at the window I had jumped out of. The screen, which had been locked, was now lying on the grass outside. I had broken out. My mind raced. The gaslighting wasn't external. It was internal. The subtle changes, the moved objects, the written word, the break-in. I was doing it to myself. My dissociated, manic self was performing a terrifying ritual at night, and my waking self was meticulously documenting the chaos, convinced someone else was the threat. I was the watcher. I was the stalker. I was the crime. I looked down at the muddy work boots. My survival instinct had dressed me, armed me, and tried to communicate with me through the only medium I trusted, the photographs. I looked back at the living room. The house was silent, but I knew it was waiting for 1:30 a.m. tomorrow night, when the other me would emerge to continue the ritual. I grabbed my keys and ran for the car, leaving the door wide open. I sped down the driveway, the tires spitting gravel. I wasn't running from a ghost. I was running from the occupant of the new house, and the occupant was me. How long could I stay awake? What was the final, desperate message my sleeping self was trying to convey with the word, "Stop I"? And what terrifying act would complete the ritual on the final, dark night? The peace I sought had turned into a terrifying, psychological battlefield.